Both Rob and Ian mentioned that had a suggestion about the fact that growers are increasingly looking to get their cereals in the ground in April. So that's going to dovetail really nicely into our next session. We've got Clarke, who is a BCG Research and Extension Officer, and she's going to come up and talk about the GRDC funded Managing Early Sown Wheat project and what we found in the last season. Can you put your hands together for Genevieve, please?
Rightio. So from 2013 to 2016, the GRDC funded the Early Sowing project, which was run in the Mallee. And one of the key findings from that project was that wheat yield declines by 35 kilograms per hectare for each day that sowing is delayed beyond the end of the first week of May. So this finding is sort of suggesting that if we are putting our spring wheat varieties in late, out of the optimal window, that we may be quite likely to cop a bit of a yield penalty. And with farm sizes increasing, it's getting increasingly difficult to get everything sown within its optimum window. And when we look, if our option is not to sow late, we can't get it in on time, can we go early? Well, with a lot of the spring wheat varieties that are available at the moment, that's going to put us into a higher frost risk when we have varieties flowering earlier than we would like them to. So there may be an option for sowing wheat varieties early without running into that higher frost risk by keeping our flowering time stabilised, and that answer comes from what we call winter wheats. And I know some of you are probably aware what winter wheats are, but for those that aren't, they differ from our commonly grown spring wheat varieties by what's called a vernalisation requirement. So that's a genetically determined driver of maturity in winter wheats, whereas our spring wheats are driven by a combination of temperature and day length. Our winter wheats require a certain exposure to cold temperatures, or a winter if you prefer, before there'll be a trigger that is switched from vegetative to reproductive growth for those winter wheat varieties. So this image down the bottom here, if I can get this working. So we've got our spring wheat varieties at the top here in our sowing periods around sort of April, May, with our different maturities. We'll have a vegetative phase here, which is from emergence to Z30, and then they'll have a switch to reproductive growth, so beyond Z30, and we see them flowering in the optimum window around the middle of September for the Mallee. And then when you look at a winter wheat, we have the opportunity to sow them earlier as they hold that vegetative phase for a lot longer, and that's due to the vernalisation requirement. So once that requirement's met, it'll change from vegetative to reproductive growth, and we still see that flowering period held stable in that optimal September window. So there's been a fair bit of work into breeding up some new winter wheat varieties that might have a suitability to low to medium rainfall zones in the southern region. And due to this breeding, the GRDC has started funding a new project. It kicked off in 2017, and it's called the Management of Early Sown Wheat project. So it's headed up by James Hunt at La Trobe University, and there's a number of partners involved, and BCG is one of them. And we're in charge of the trials in the Birchip and Horsham region, but we've got trials that are running across South Australia and Victoria, and there's also collaboration from New South Wales DPI in New South Wales. So the project is made up of 3 main experiments. BCG is working on the first 2, and those are looking at the different winter wheat varieties and early times of sowing, and how they're performing when they're sown early, and what sort of window is preferable for these varieties. The second experiment is looking at 3 different winter wheat varieties at the different sowing times, but also with 3 different irrigation rates, which are representative of what we might receive in an early break and whether there is opportunity there. The third project, which BCG isn't involved in, but that's looking at the opportunity for dual purpose grazing with these winter wheats sown early, and then also nitrogen management. So just to recap, we ran our first year of trials at the Currio main site and Longrenong in 2017. And the outcomes from those trials were that March to April sown winter wheats performed comparably to main season springs that were sown in their optimal window. And the optimal time of sowing for winter wheats was actually late March to mid-April, so there is opportunity to sow early there. And longsword, which was formerly known as RAC 2341, actually failed to perform due to unexplained sterility. So there was a fair bit of hope for that variety, but in 2017 it didn't really come through. So switch to last season, so we can all probably agree that 2018 was a pretty different year to 2017. So we ran our trials at the Narraport main site last year and also at Rupanyup. And at both those sites, we had well below average growing season rainfall. Before I get too far into it, I just wanted to outline the difference between these sites. So in terms of their paddock history, our Narraport site was established on a long fallow, and we had 76 millimetres of starting soil moisture. Whereas when we look at the Rupanyup site, it was actually established on a lentil stubble and had 45 millimetres of starting soil moisture. So the first experiment, which is our looking at varieties by times of sowing, I'm just going to touch fairly briefly on these results today because there's a lot in this project. But we've got, at each site, we had 9 varieties sown, a mixture of winter and spring varieties, and a mixture of maturities for the both. So as you can see here, we can get different maturities in winter wheats as well. So they don't all run quite at the same pace. And then we have what we probably call a bit of a check line here. We have Scepter as a spring wheat, and when we look at our times of sowing, we've put Scepter as time of sowing 4 as a bit of a benchmark of where we can aim for, which is getting into that optimal window for a spring wheat, and how early sown winter wheats perform in comparison to that. So as I said, we are sowing early. These are the sowing dates that we had last year at the different sites. But what we're aiming for is a mid-March sowing as the first time of sowing, then our start of April, middle of April, and then the start of May. Obviously last year we didn't have an early break, so at each time of sowing they did receive 10 millimetres of drip irrigation just to get them out of the ground, so we did achieve that time of sowing. So it's a bit of a complicated graph, this one, but it does explain quite well what happened in terms of yield and maturity and flowering dates. I'll just let it sink in for a minute. This is taken from our Narraport site last year. On the right-hand axis here, we've got temperature. So this is our shaded area at the back of the graph. The grey area is our maximum temperature for that date, and then the darker area is our minimum temperature received on that date at the site. This rectangle here is representative of our estimated optimal flowering window, and then we've got grain yield on the left-hand axis. So each of these series is representative of a variety that was sown, and this marker here is representative of the heading date of the first time of sowing and the respective yield for that. So just as an example, this is our Scepter, and this is time of sowing 1. We've yielded about 2 tonnes at the site, although it started to flower around that middle to late July. So it's just been lucky enough last year to escape the frost, but I don't think many people in here would be comfortable if they had Scepter flowering in the middle of July. So what I would like to point out here is this is our Scepter line. Here we've got Trojan, and then underneath there we've got Cutlass. And our consecutive times of sowing, the flowering has actually occurred a lot more spread out. So between mid-July for Septa up until that optimal flowering period around the middle of September for the different times of sowing. And then around here we've got quite a cluster, and these are our winter wheat varieties, and you can see that for the different times of sowing, they've actually flowered within a lot shorter windows, so that's that vernalisation requirement coming into play there. So last year our yield results, not too bad considering the season, but it was on that fallows, which really got them through in the end. But we've had the fourth time of sowing for each variety was actually the highest yielding, which was a little bit unexpected for the winter wheat varieties, which have shown that they can perform quite well when sown early. I can't really explain that result, but that's what we saw last year. And although we've got these spring wheat varieties up here performing really well, statistically we did have some winter wheat varieties. So we had the Dow line, which is ADV 159001, performing equally as well, along with Longsword and LPB 140392 at the fourth time of sowing. So there is a little bit of potential there that they can perform as well as the spring varieties. So our yield from the Rupanyup site last year, the Rupanyup site really struggled with moisture stress, and it got fairly frosted as well, but it's difficult to sort of differentiate those two. And I've just put an image up here. This is our very sad looking first time of sowing plot, which received only 10 millimetres of moisture, and it came up, and then about 80% of the plots actually died. Then we had a bit of a re-emergence for what came from a following rainfall, and so we did actually get yields off those plots, but I can't be certain that that was from the first time of sowing. So for that reason, I've actually taken those results out of this presentation and from the manual as well. So as you can see, in general, a lot lower yielding than the Narraport site, and that probably comes back down to that starting soil moisture as well as the tough conditions. So as I said, we've got Septa time of sowing 4, which is edging into that optimal sowing window, and that was in fact the highest yielding variety and time of sowing at the Rupanyup site. And none of the other winters, except for DS Bennett at the second time of sowing, so that's the start of April, actually performed as well as Septa. So there is some potential there that even in a really tough season when sown early, that winter wheat varieties can perform as well as a spring wheat sown in its optimal period. So there is a lot more information on that experiment 1, and that'll be in your manuals in front of you. But moving on to experiment 2, so this is where we looked at 3 different winter wheat varieties, so DS Bennett, Kitty Hawk and Longsword, at the same 4 times of sowing as the previous trial, so everything was sown together. But at immediately following sowing, they received 3 different rates of irrigation, so that's how much of a break is enough of a break to get these varieties up and running and through to grain yield at the end of the season. So looking at establishment, our Rupanyup site did actually have a response to irrigation at sowing. So our aim was to establish 150 plants per metre squared, and we didn't in fact quite reach those targeted numbers, probably a result of the tough start to the season even with irrigation. So when the plots received more than 10 millimetres of rainfall, we saw an increase in plant establishment numbers. And actually time of sowing 3 achieved the highest establishment, but that was probably because in the week leading up to it, the site received about 6 to 7 mils of rainfall. When we look at yields from Rupanyup in the irrigation rate trial, we did see an increase in yield from increased irrigation at Sowing, more so in DS Bennett and Kitty Hawk than in Longsword, which wasn't as responsive to the increased irrigation rate. But what I wanted to highlight here, that DS Bennett, which is one of the longer season winter varieties, actually had quite stable yields across the different times of sowing at each irrigation rate. So just to outline here, these are our different irrigation rates. You can see it's kept fairly stable across those different times of sowing for those irrigation rates. I just put a little bit of an image in there because I know none of you have actually seen the trials. But this I took around flowering time at the site, and you can, if the projector's good enough, you can see on the left-hand side, so we've irrigated up all rows with 10 mils, but the middle 4 rows received that extra irrigation, and we did our assessments and yield from the middle 4 rows. So the left-hand side, we've got a little bit less biomass, bit of a visual difference when we compare to the 50 mil treatment on the right-hand side, where the middle 4 rows you can really see a lot more biomass put on there. So when we moved to the Narraport site and look at our establishment, we did see a similar pattern. So when we had irrigation above 10 millimetres, we saw more plants established, but then no difference between 25 and 50 mils. And that generally increased with later times of sowing. We saw better establishment, and that might come down to the fact that as we get to the later times of sowing, our soil temperatures are starting to decrease, and it's not quite as tough for plants to get going. And again, we were aiming for 150 plants per metre squared here, and we didn't quite reach that target. I've put in another little image here to show you what it looked like early on at the site. We had the left-hand side here received 10 mils at irrigation, the middle plot received 25, and the right-hand plot received the 50 mils. So we did see a little bit of a positive visualisation of what was happening early on. But then when we came to yields, it wasn't exactly 100% what we were expecting. So DS Bennett, again, that longer season winter variety, it yielded highest at the 25 mil treatment, out yielding Kitty Hawk and Longsword. And then at the 50 mil treatment, DS Bennett and Kitty Hawk outperformed Longsword. So we had pretty good yields on this fallow paddock. There was no difference between varieties and their yields at the 10 mil treatment. So we saw a general yield increase with later sowing, but when we came to time of sowing 1, this is where we didn't exactly expect this result, but we've got a theory as to why this might have happened. So when we had irrigation increased above 10 millimetres, we actually saw a yield reduction, which we sort of went, what's going on here? And then we developed a bit of a theory. So we received a yield reduction from irrigation rate on the early sown treatment, so that's looking around that mid-March period. And when you think back to the site that we established this trial on, it was that long fallow and it did have that bit more starting soil moisture. So we thought maybe this treatment's gotten going early, it's used up all the soil moisture, and then it's cut off too soon to fill yield. So we've pulled out the NDVI data, which for those who aren't aware is probably best described as a measure of greenness. And we've taken NDVI measurements throughout the season. So on the left-hand side here, I've pulled out the average NDVI for all of time of sowing 1 with the different irrigation rates. So this one here is our 50 mil treatment and our 25. And you can see compared to the 10 mil treatment, they've taken off a lot faster. They've gotten going. And then we've seen this flip-flop where the 10 mil treatment has come through growing more regularly and has actually lasted a little bit longer throughout the season and has just been able to capture that bit more moisture later on in the season and convert that into yield. And just to reiterate here, I've pulled out, these are just the 10 millimetre treatments for the different times of sowing. And over time, we've seen, obviously, time of sowing 1 was in before 2, 3 and 4. So time of sowing 1 sort of taking off a bit faster. We're seeing that flip-flop again, and it's cutting off faster as well. So that's our theory as to why we might have seen a yield decrease with an increase in irrigation rate at sowing. But again, it probably comes down to the fact that the season was dry at the end. Well, it was pretty dry the whole way through, but the season cut off and they had used all that soil moisture before they could put on yield. So our take-home messages from the 2018 season is that winter wheats can match but not exceed yields of spring wheats that were sown in their optimal window. And it's only advantageous to sow paddocks early to winter wheats if they're otherwise going to be sown late and cop a yield penalty, or if they're needed for dual purpose, so grazing as well. In a dry season, sowing earlier than late April reduced yields when stored soil water was present following a long fallow, so what we saw at the main site, and that 10 millimetres may not be enough moisture at sowing to establish a crop early that will survive through to winter on heavy clay soil without follow-up rain. So that was our first time of sowing at Rupanyup that showed that there. Again, I'd like to acknowledge that the management of early sown wheat projects funded by the GRDC and headed up by La Trobe University. And it's a lot to take in. It's a huge project, but are there any questions?
So Genevieve, the real challenge of winter wheats is that they will use too much of their moisture early because the crop's growing longer and more likely to run out of moisture at the end of the season. Is that really a take-home message?
I think it really does depend how the season shapes up. As I said, there was that third trial that's part of the project, but we're not running, where it looks at grazing as well. So that could potentially slow varieties down a bit. But yeah, I mean, if you're establishing something earlier, you've got a longer growing season and it's got to stay alive. So I don't know to what extent, and we probably need to do a bit more research, but we did see on that long fallow that when it was sown in that mid-March, which is probably a little bit too early, we've seen from the results so far that it might have used a little bit more soil moisture.
Jen, can I just ask a question? So on top of Ian's, is how much was our rooting zone at our main site? So how deep? And that, I think, would contribute to that, Ian, is how deep your rooting zone can go, is whether how long that can last for.
I can't answer that question, sorry.
Genevieve, Rob Christie from SeedNet. Just an answer to your question, Ian. These winter wheats in the early part of their growing season are very prostrate, and I don't believe they use up that growing season rainfall earlier on because they don't have that extended growth. They're very dormant and very low dry matter. And can I ask a question to Genevieve? If we have a good year, will BCG continue these trials, and will you have a treatment in there for grazing for the winter wheats, as Nick Poole has for his hyper yielding trials in southern Victoria and Tasmania? He has a grazing treatment for the winter wheats.
Yeah, so I'm really interested in the grazing treatments, but as this project goes, we're just looking at the time of sowing and the variety comparisons along with the irrigation rates, but it's potentially something that we can look to in the future and something that's relevant to a lot of our members with mixed systems.
Jen, I'll have an opposing view from Dad and we can have our family argument in public. By having that early sowing of winter wheat, it might mean that the roots have more time to explore the soil and extract more moisture from the soil that a spring wheat may not be able to do. I'd be interesting to look at lower limits of winter wheats as compared to to spring wheats.
Yeah, I think it also might play a bit of a role about whether it does have enough moisture to get down and really explore that subsoil early. So that's what I think the difference there really was with that 10 mil versus the 25 and 50, is that they could close that gap between the topsoil and the subsoil moisture a little bit faster and probably grow more vigorously.
With regard to the time of sowing trials, did you do any trials where you sowed the wheat early but dry? And was there a yield disadvantage of having that seed sitting in the soil for 6 weeks before it actually rained?
So we irrigated everything that we put in because we were really chasing those times of sowing, so we wanted to make sure that they did come up. But we've put a little demo in sown last Friday to see if we can get something up without irrigation, considering we had that big rain in December and a bit of a rain last week as well, so we'll see. Come back next year.
Can I ask you to join your hands together and thank Genevieve? It's big thing to get up here in front of that many people, and we really appreciate your efforts, and also fantastic feedbacks and comments from the floor that we can certainly use in looking at how we continue to develop our trials for this project and other projects going forward.